Let me all welcome you to this event on multiculturalism, immigration, immigrant integration, and a comparative transatlantic perspective that, as I would like to acknowledge, takes place in Coast and Strait Salish territory. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm the director of the Center for Global Studies that has the privilege to organize this event with very generous support from the EU Center of Excellence that is housed also at the Center for Global Studies. And before I introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, let me reflect very briefly on why we thought it would be a good idea to have such an event that looks at the comparative perspective in Canada and Europe in the field of migration and multiculturalism. And probably 10, 15 years ago, the argument that you would have encountered is, why would you compare two parts of the world that have very different histories and very different trajectories when it comes to dealing with issues of migration and diversity? On the one hand, you would have Canada as a classical immigrant society with a long trajectory and a legacy of multiculturalism as a state policy. On the other hand, European countries that only very recently and sometimes reluctantly have become countries of immigration that look at multiculturalism with a great degree of skepticism, if not hostility, more recently. And so, to a certain degree, it seems that we have very different forms of addressing these kind of issues. At the same time, that might be somewhat surprising to see, there has been a certain degree of convergence when it comes to these kind of questions. I just allude to a couple of those things here. One would be that although you might have heard about how rather aggressive the backlash against multiculturalism has been in Europe, the German Chancellor declaring that multiculturalism has utterly failed, although almost none of the European countries has ever adopted multiculturalism as a policy. In spite of this rhetoric, in Europe there have been quite some range of policy trying to address and accommodate cultural diversity implemented on the ground. So in a way, European countries, in spite of this rhetoric, have moved towards some of the policies that have been in place in Canada for quite some time. The second point is that Canada hasn't been entirely immune from the kind of rhetoric we've heard lately in the European context. Think about issues of securitizing the issue of migration, the issue of the drain on the welfare state. In general, the very skeptical perspective on immigration and what the state ought to do in this respect, and probably to a certain extent what we've seen in Canada over the last couple of weeks after the shooting in Ottawa, is some kind of evidence of very similar forms of public debates and public discourses on both sides of the Atlantic. And lastly, we have also seen some degree of convergence with respect to policy formation on both sides of the Atlantic. In the Canadian context, it's, for me as someone from Europe and studying mostly Europe, it's quite surprising to see some of the initiatives like the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, its massive expansion, Canada's change in its refugee laws, a couple of developments that are quite similar to what we've seen traditionally more in the European context. And to be honest, I don't know anyone who could make better sense of these kind of developments than our keynote speaker for today, Professor Keith Banting, who joins us today for a very short trip, and I'm very thankful that you may go your way all the way from snowy Ontario, from Queen's University out here to Victoria. And let me introduce Keith a bit more fully. Dr. Keith Banting has earned his doctorate from Oxford University and is a Queen's Research Chair in Public Policy and a professor in the School of Policy Studies and Department of Political Studies at Queen's University. In 2004, he was appointed a member of the Order of Canada, and in 2012, he was elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and he was also awarded an honorary doctorate by Stockholm University and received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal. And Keith Banting has done great degree of work in public policy information in the Canadian context, and over the last couple of years has moved increasingly to issues of immigration, of integration, multiculturalism, primarily but not exclusively through his lens of the welfare state response to these kind of issues. So it's a great pleasure having you here, Keith. I give you the floor. I will introduce our two discussants more fully after your talk. Keith, the floor is yours, and welcome to Victoria.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Oliver and to the Center for the invitation to come. One thing he didn't mention is that I actually started my teaching career in British Columbia. I taught for 13 years at the University of British Columbia, that small institution just across the water. And so I always take any advantage, any opportunity to come back to the West Coast. It's my sort of second home, as it were. Unfortunately, this trip was going to be a leisurely and lengthy one, but then life took over, and so it's going to be short, but I'm really pleased to be here, nonetheless. So Oliver's actually done a very good job of introducing the topic that I'm going to be addressing today. And so the question I'm going to be looking at is, to what extent can one say there is an element of transatlantic convergence going on when one looks at multiculturalism and immigrant integration in Canada and Europe? Because as Oliver said, the traditional image of the two parts of the world would suggest that there are actually, if anything, there's a divergence going on, that there is a significant backlash in Europe against the idea of multiculturalism. The introduction of relatively restrictive policies in a number of countries have been highlighted. I guess Denmark and the Netherlands tend to get most of the ink, but across a number of countries there's been a deep stiffening and turn in the approach to immigration and the approach to diversity policy in parts of Europe. The observation, Oliver's already mentioned the observation of Chancellor Merkel that multiculturalism has failed utterly, and the rejection by Prime Minister, now why that says Brown, I'm not sure, but by Prime Minister Cameron of the UK, that state multiculturalism had to be rejected in excuse me, in favor of a muscular liberalism. So there, and in the European context, this discourse, this way of thinking and talking and presenting and debating these issues, has tended to assume that one needs to reject multiculturalism to adopt a different approach, which has been often called civic integration, an emphasis on integrating newcomers more fully into the economic and social and cultural mainstream of those societies. It is as if one had to reject that there was something deeply inconsistent with a multicultural strategy and an integrative strategy. These two things were seen as things that could not be harnessed together. In the Canadian context, on the other hand, there's a higher level of stability in our multicultural discourse. It still, I think, in some ways is seen as a defining element in our identity, although I'll be putting up some data on public attitudes, and we'll see that it's not quite as deep as one might have, as the discourse or the debates and rhetoric might lead you to believe. But in the Canadian context, we've also had a very heavy historic emphasis on integration, on what the Europeans would call civic integration. We have always believed that multiculturalism and civic integration can go together, and indeed I would argue that the best way of describing the Canadian model is to call it multicultural integration. It's an integrationist concept of multiculturalism, and it has been coupled with and much more heavily funded on the integration side for all of the days that we have talked about ourselves as multicultural. And so I think we are an exemplar of the proposition that you can marry multiculturalism and civic integration. It's a stable, potentially stable political equilibrium in Western nations. And this is not a way of thinking that's common in at least some European countries. So the image, I think, has been one of divergence, but as Oliver also said, there are elements of convergence. I'm going to talk briefly about Europe, and partly because that was, I was under strict orders from Oliver. I couldn't come if I wouldn't talk about Europe. So I'm going to talk about Europe, and I'm going to make the case that the retreat from multiculturalism in Europe is much more at the level of discourse than policy. That if you look at the actual policy structures in many European countries, there are elements that we would call multicultural They will not often. They will call it intercultural or diversity policy, pluralism. They'll have a variety of terms, but it would look a lot like what we would call multicultural policies. And also there are very different approaches to the integration project in Europe, some of which could easily be managed or married to a multicultural ethos, and indeed in some countries is. And so, although there are many countries which have adopted a much more coercive or assimilative approach, I'm going to be arguing that there are cases of multicultural integration that look very Canadian. Indeed, I'm going to make the claim before I'm done that probably the best exemplar of multicultural integration actually is not Canada today. It's one of the European countries, and I'll come back to that. Canada, we have also had reform. We've had reform by stealth. And I'll talk more about that. We've had dualism, that is, the debate in Quebec has had distinctive characteristics, and one question is whether there is a Canadian model of sort of multiculturalism and immigrant integration, or whether there are actually two different models here, and whether we're replicating the variation that you see in Europe within the Canadian context itself. And I think we have, and I'll talk more about this as well, an uncertain capacity to incorporate new forms of diversity. And so, convergence, divergence, I think there's a bit of both going on up there. In some cases we are moving apart, in some cases, if you look at particular pairs of countries, we're actually much closer together. So, I guess this is a very academic thing to do, but it's more complex than it seems in the imagery. It's a very diverse, multifaceted pattern when you look more carefully. So I'm going to be talking about multiculturalism. What do I mean by it? Multiculturalism is a term which has a million... I once was doing some work on the prospects of the middle class in my work on redistribution, and I checked out, and apparently there are 720 definitions of the middle class. Someone actually counted 720 different definitions of the middle class. There probably aren't that many definitions of multiculturalism, but there are a lot. People differ deeply in what they think a multicultural strategy is and what the implications of multiculturalism are. And indeed, the form, the policy package that Mrs. Merkel was rejecting, I think was not simply a policy package that Germany had never implemented. It was not a policy package that Canada had ever implemented, not in the way she was thinking about it, because she was seeing multiculturalism as the embrace of distinct or separate societies internally. And we've never thought of multiculturalism in that particular way. So, how am I going to use the term? And how will I be operationalizing it? Work with my colleague at Queen's, Will Kimlicka. We've worked to develop something called a multiculturalism policy index. And that index is based on a particular conception of multiculturalism policy, which is as follows. We see multiculturalism policies not as the guarantee of equal individual rights as citizens, which we think are important, but that's not what we mean by it. We mean by multiculturalism policies, policies which go beyond the guarantee of equal rights to recognize, to accommodate, and to support difference, to support cultural differences emerging from ethnic diversity. So, recognize meaning see it and legitimate it. Accommodate meaning changing domestic institutions or practices to make it easier for people of different backgrounds to be comfortable in the country and participate in it. And support in the sense of provision of clear, either regulatory or fiscal support to enable people to participate actively without having to surrender their cultural differences. So it's a particular set of programs, and we chose 8 indicators which we think capture that conception of recognition, accommodation, and support. So here's the 8 indicators we developed for our little multiculturalism policy index. The first 3 capture the idea of recognition, saying symbolically that this is a diverse place and that diverse peoples have a part of the society. One is the formal affirmation of multiculturalism in the constitution of the country or in nationally applicable legislation. A statement that this is a multicultural place. You don't have to use the multicultural, a culturally diverse place, but a statement that this is not simply the home of a historic cultural majority. Multiculturalism in the school curricula, making sure that the contributions of cultural or ethnic and cultural minorities are accurately as well, but actively incorporated in what people are taught in secondary schools. Inclusion in the mandate of public broadcasters that they must represent the diversity of society in their programming. That it's not acceptable to present the society as a, say, lily white society if in fact there are cultural minorities as part of that society. So 3 of our measures through which we try and capture the idea of recognition, seeing people and legitimating their presence. 2 we have here the next 2 are about accommodation. Trying to change the domestic institutions in ways which make it easier for people to participate. So exemption from dress codes, from official dress codes. That'll pop up a number of times in my talk. It's clearly sensitive. And allowing dual citizenship. And then the last 3, excuse me, are indicators of support. Funding of ethnic groups, funding bilingual education, by which we mean education in the heritage language as well as in the common language of the new society, and some form of affirmative action programs, or what in Canada we call employment equity programming. So those are 8 indicators, not perfect. There are other indicators we might have chosen, but those are the 8 we ran with. And we then, by employing legions of research assistants, look to see in 21 countries whether they have these policies or not, and how they have changed over time. Okay? So, 21 countries, all democratic, relatively affluent democratic countries. Do they have these policies? Not. So we have the data for 1980, 2000, and 2010. Now I've got them in to make it simpler, I've just put them as a scatter plot. And as you can see, this is 1980. On the bottom axis, we have the policy score, that is, the extent to which countries have adopted multiculturalism policies. And the further down you go to the right, the stronger the multiculturalism policies. And on this axis, on the vertical axis, we just put the proportion of the population born outside the countries. Right? So in 1980, life was pretty simple, right? You had a very large group of countries in the lower left, which is to say countries with very small or very low levels of foreign-born population, and then a few countries, a few outliers in the upper right, Australia and Canada, traditional immigrant countries, and they had adopted more in the way of multiculturalism policies. If you roll the tape forward to the year 2000, you can see a bigger spread, countries moving upwards to the right, that is to say, larger levels of immigration, so larger proportion of population born outside the country, and more of a spread on the policy score. When in 2000, when we did this, or when we finally produced the 2000 stuff, which we did published about 2006, I used to tell the simple story. It's actually pretty simple. You could run a line, through from the bottom left upwards to the right, and basically the real story is the proportion of the population born outside the country. There's a group of countries in the lower left which have very little immigrant population, has very small immigrant populations, and don't have multiculturalism policies. Duh, right? If there aren't large groups demanding recognition, it's unlikely you'll recognize them. So then at the top end, you have the countries which have much higher levels of foreign-born population and stronger policies. And then I would say when this was the chart. And the interesting thing is in the middle. You know, those are the battleground states. Those are the states which are around 10% of the population born outside the country, where you have great diversity. Some have, they're on the right-hand side, have adopted multicultural strategies. Some on the left side of the chart, still at the 10% level, have not. You've got more diversity in how countries are responding at the 10% level, and more battles. It's more intensely controversial in those societies. So that's what I used to say. It's about the proportion of population born outside the country, and in the middle ground, it's quite contentious. And then we updated the data for 2010, and all of a sudden I don't have a story anymore. Right? Because there's virtually no relationship now between size of the population born outside the country and the strength of multiculturalism policies. At any level of foreign-born population, you've got countries spread along that axis. It's like gone. And so it's an interesting question. It suggests now that the politics of multiculturalism are more diverse and are much more sensitive to, I suspect, domestic, political, and cultural orientations towards diversity and immigration. But the big story here, right, is we're still moving up and to the right. There's no evidence here of a retreat from multiculturalism. As a general international phenomenon, there are more countries towards the right-hand side of the graph than the left-hand side of the graph, despite all the debate about retreat, not evident in this data if you define multiculturalism in this way. So I'll come back to that for the European case in a minute. So that's what I mean by multiculturalism policies. The second part I'm going to talk about are the integration side of the package. And here the core elements are, as you I'm sure are familiar with, an emphasis on integration into the economic and social mainstream of society. Emphases in the civic integration models, certainly in Europe, said we also have to maintain strong respect for liberal democratic norms as part of this integration package, and that it's desirable in most of these program structures that people who come to the country learn the language, the history, and the institutions of the country. What is important here, and I'm going to talk about this in the European, I'm going to put the numbers up in the European context, is the nature of that package. There's great variation between whether or not the civic integration strategy is basically what I've labeled here a liberal civic integration strategy, one which emphasizes the right to integrate, excuse me, or whether it's an obligatory thing that immigrants must integrate. It's a duty. Is it a right or a duty to integrate into the new society? There's great variation in the level of support that governments give to newcomers, whether to help them in this integration process. And governments vary in the types of levers they bring to bear. Tests, courses, in some cases written individual contracts between the individual and the state requiring them to proceed. Someone has built an index of this to complement the multiculturalism index I described, and I won't go into great details about this index. It's built on a number of dimensions, but it generally is designed to measure the extent to which government programs put pressure on people to integrate by attaching formal requirements to integration steps that must be completed. For example, if you want to maintain your residency, you may not be able to get your residency extended if you don't complete this. And certainly for permanent residency, these would be heavily required. So there's this level of severity which varies from a 0 to 6. A low score indicates a thin set of requirements. A high score indicates a thick set of requirements in this index. So it basically produces two models. What I'm calling